Hello, I'm your host Jerry Orrs, and welcome to Professional View, a series of interviews that takes a deep dive into the CG industry and the many jobs and opportunities it has to offer. Professional View is part of the VIEWConference, a yearly CG event that has taken place between October 17th and October 22nd in Italy. For more information about it, go to viewconference.it. Today, we are with Louise Bagnall, who is the creative director at Cartoon Saloon. Not only that, Louise has a long career in animation, working on amazing projects like The Amazing World of Gumball, and also had her animated short film nominated for an Academy Award. And Louise, to get started with, I want to talk a little bit about the difference between these two places in your career. You know, being an animator, working on the shots, working on the character movements, and being more on the decision-making side, being the creative director, being a director of your own short film. Can you talk a little bit about what the difference between these two roles are?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is quite a difference, and there's quite a jump between working on a team, working as part of the team as an animator, and then being a director in charge of basically animators. And I think for me, like my experience working on something like Gumball, it's a TV series and it has a large team of animators, and they have a workflow and a quota every week, and that gives a certain amount of, you have a responsibility as a team member to hit the quality level and to meet your quotas, and that's partly for the rest of your team members so that they don't have to pull up your slack, but also for a responsibility to your supervisor or to your director to fulfill. But on the other side, when you're a director, you also have responsibility, and in a way that responsibility feels, you have responsibility to every single person on your crew, on your team, and that's about keeping them on board with what you're making and keeping them motivated, I think, as well, and giving them the information they need in order to do their jobs correctly. So I think in a way, like, there is a responsibility in both directions, and sometimes as an animator you don't always realize the other side of the responsibility is also for those people up there. I would say as well, like, it is just a very working as an animator, sometimes you do feel a bit like a cog in a big machine. But you're a totally necessary cog. If you pull out that cog, it's still gonna fall down, So whereas as the director, you do have to you have to keep a lot of things going at the same time. You have to be aware of what's happening in multiple teams at the same time and all that kind of stuff. So I think as a director, you just have to really, you really have to consider your teams as well. Like, individual people are on those teams and they all need help and they all need guidance. And I do think that working as an animator before becoming a director is a really good experience, because it helps to keep that stuff in mind. When you're directing, you remember how it was to be on a team and what it was like to get notes back and that kind of stuff. So I think it helps you to be a more considerate director.
So true, so true. And before we talk a little bit more about animation and just the craft of animation, I want to talk a little bit about deadlines. Like you said, you have a quota you need to fill as an animator, and on TV shows, it's a very, very fast quota. I mean, for a film, I believe generally Cartoon Saloon films, correct me if I'm wrong, Jake, generally take 2 to 3 years. Animation takes a long time. While with animated TV shows, you generally need to get a season out very, very quickly, because they're releasing a season generally once a year. And those aren't short. Those are a lot of animation. So can you talk a little bit about just like the nature of deadlines, the nature of what you need to prioritize in TV versus film because of that very fast turnaround?
Yeah, I mean, I think, time definitely always the limit that we're always pushed up against, whether it's feature or TV series. And I think what you're saying there is basically, with a TV series, you have a lot more hours, you have a lot more footage essentially to make in a shorter amount of time. Whereas with the feature, you have, let's say, a 90-minute film, but you're making that over 2 or 3 years. So there is a very big difference in how the workload is split. With TV, you have to think about it as a marathon, in terms of, like, it's ongoing. It's going to be repeated. You are doing many iterations. You're doing many episodes. So that means that you're going to have, it's not all about this one scene or this one moment in this one scene, in this one episode. You think about it in a bigger sense of, like, well, maybe if I didn't hit the nail on the head on that one, I'll get another chance in the next episode. So you have a chance to improve over iteration, and you have a chance as well to get faster as the project moves on, as the project develops. As you do more and more episodes, generally teams get faster. On a feature film, you've got one shot. you know, as in you're only going through the film once, you're only making one film. So you have one, you know, there's one climax in the end of the film and that kind of stuff. So you really have to think more about the strategy for how you're going to get there. When are you going to focus on, where do you want to spend your time? Where do you want all the team members to spend their time? And as an animator, you need to think about, like, where does this fit within the film? Is this the high point of the film? Is this the bit where I go overboard, you know, can go all out with the acting? Or is this actually, if I don't spend too much time on this moment now, like, you know, if it's not as big a deal, then it means I'll get more time to spend on the big moment, you know, that I have to animate. So you have to think about it as more of you know, you need to look at the whole film. On a TV series, you have a chance to kind of, you know, you almost have a chance to improve as you're going along, or to get faster as you're going along. But there is a lot of pressure in TV to just be constantly delivering. And that it does take a little bit of a toll. So I'd always say, like, don't forget to take your holidays. You know, you're going to need them probably. But at the same time, it is something that you always see that people they get faster, they get quicker. They if you understand the style of the animation, for example, you can start to develop ways of, like, getting through your sequences and your scenes faster and that kind of stuff. So it always seems to get faster and faster as things go along in TV. You know, as the project, as the episodes are completed, it tends to get a bit faster, which is great. So that's kind of the biggest thing. You know, you do get time in feature to really think more about what you're animating, for example, but then you only get one chance to do that. Whereas in TV, you don't get as much time, but you might get more chances. You might get more different types of scenes and stuff like that. So
that makes a lot of sense. And what you're talking about, moments, you know, that's a fundamental concept in animation, is getting the moment correct, because that is really how you demonstrate as an animator the character. You know, you're acting through the character in animation. Now, you see the perspective of moments both as the animator when you're actually making the sequences, when you're animating the individual movements, but you've also seen it as the perspective of the director when you're looking at the story as a whole, when you're seeing the context of everything you're doing. So can you talk a little bit about your process on both sides for developing that block-to-block movement, you know, how a character moves their arms, their walk cycle, and really getting their personality out there through movement and through moments?
Yeah, I think the first thing to just think about is, what is the style of animation? And sometimes it's really obvious, you know, is this going to be like a Looney Tunes style, you know, short that's going to have wacky, kind of really zany animation? Or is this going to be much more realistic, sensitive, subtle animation? What is the emotional drive of the scene? Is it a gag scene, in which case you need to be on top of your, you know, your timing, because the humor will come from, of course, as we all know, from the timing. Or is it really about a subtle emotion that is only going to be noticeable if you have a very still moment, and you really, maybe the animation is really just focusing in on the eye, you know, the eye movement. It could be as subtle as that, you know, little eye darts or something like that. So I think you have to firstly be aware of, like, what is the style of animation, the big broad strokes of animation, what kind of project is this? And then underneath that, it's like, what is the emotional drive? What is the need of the scene? And it's very, I suppose, like, I think it is probably quite like acting in that way, where you really need to think about, like, what is the purpose of this scene? What is the emotional drive? What am I trying to communicate in this scene that's maybe not in the dialogue, or maybe there's no dialogue and I'm trying to communicate it, you know, through the acting and the body language. Maybe you don't even see the face, you know. So there's always things you have to consider like that. And if you can look beyond just the you know, the surface of, like, is it an angry face or is it a happy face? If you can look beyond that and think about what's the emotional drive and where it is in the sequence, you know, is it building up to something, or is it, you know, the climax of the moment, or is it that kind of thing? If you know that, then you can basically build your animation. You can think about that as you're animating, and that really helps to approach it. But the style of animation, it's something that, like, I think it's really interesting, because I don't think there's a right or wrong answer with style. I think there's just about what is the project and what is the sensibility of the project and how to suit that.
Well, Cartoon Saloon certainly has shown that style can be an extremely flexible thing. I mean, if you look at Breadwinner, for example, which is a Cartoon Saloon film, it was Academy nominated. It's an amazing animated film. If you haven't seen it, check it out. But anyway, there's two distinct styles in that. You have the style kind of like the fantasy sequence when they're telling stories and it goes into this imagination land. And then you also have the more lifelike style, which is supposed to more mimic real life. those are two very distinct styles, and you're currently creative director of Cartoon Saloon, so you're really managing the creative styles of the films. Can you talk a little bit about the responsibilities that job entails and how it's different from your previous roles?
Yeah, so creative director is kind of a title that it could mean different things depending on the studio. In Cartoon Saloon, basically, there's a small number of creative directors in the studio, and essentially we're a little team that helps to oversee the bigger general creative choices in the studio. We're just basically like almost like a little council, a creative council that helps to have input at moments that might need it, from either other people on the creative council or from the projects that come in or the stuff that we're developing. So it's essentially a little like, brain trust of like creatives in the studio who understand a lot of what Cartoon Saloon is trying to create and trying to make. With Breadwinner, it's one of those times where like I was on that project not as creative director, but as a character designer, for example, so you can see it from both sides as well. And I think like every project does need its own identity, even if the Cartoon Saloon projects generally have some people can see like similarities between the projects, but overall, like it's important that every single project has its own creative identity, and that means its own approach. And you want to bring fresh ideas to the table each time. You don't want to just be relying on what you've done before. And that's like part of being on the creative council is like, looking for that stuff, pushing for that stuff, and making sure that it's in the conversation all the time as well.
It's something that I find really interesting about Cartoon Saloon is that it captures culture very well. A lot of the films take place in Ireland, in historic Ireland, but Breadwinner, if we're going back to that example, doesn't take place. I believe it takes place in Afghanistan. That's a very different culture than a lot of the other films show. So can you talk a little bit about the process for capturing the culture, not only in story, but in animation too? Just the style of animation is representing the culture it's covering.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is making sure that you have people on the project behind the camera, as it was, who are helping to make those creative decisions, who are from that culture or know that culture or can give you that basically expert information that if you don't have that, you're going to make something that's just basically an outside look in rather than an inside, feeling. So that was very important, I know, for the Breadwinner, was to really make sure that there was those people on the project and make sure that was a big part of the visual style development and also the story development and many other things like the voice acting and a lot of those decisions as well. And then, you're also looking at like every culture has its own visual art history and everything like that. And sometimes we don't see it very visibly in our own, mainstream culture, but it is there. And as soon as you start digging, there's often fascinating stuff there. And I know that was like, a big part of the sort of story world in the Breadwinner. The fantasy sections were inspired by some of the kind of Persian art that has this really intricate, little pattern details and stuff like that. So, you're taking influences from different places, but you're generally wanting to be focused on that culture and make sure that you really have an understanding of what's driven some of those artistic choices, as well as like the people and what's going on there now and in terms of artistically as well. So you kind of want to imbue that in the project just from all the way through. And I think, being in Ireland, we are constantly seeing, like we are not the dominant culture that we see. Obviously, we all know a lot about Irish culture if you're living in Ireland, but at the same time, we get a lot of influences from outside cultures because, we're a small country and, we see a lot of obviously US stuff and UK stuff and things from Europe, and you're always kind of aware of what's going on outside your own boundaries, I suppose. And that's really important to just be curious about that stuff. If you don't have that curiosity, then you're not going to find it very easy to make the films that you want to make,
I think that's a great quote. And what I also love about, how it represents the culture is it really, like you said earlier, makes each film distinct. Like Wolfwalkers versus Breadwinner. Very different styles. Wolfwalkers looks more like an Irish fairy tale than any sort of Persian art because that's the story it's telling. Now, going back a little bit towards the concept of story, one thing that is very big in animation, like we were talking about, is visual storytelling, conveying things through images, not necessarily through words. And in my opinion, you're a master at that. And I think a great example of that is a comic you put on Twitter, Buried Deep. It's a very short comic. People can look it up. It's extremely emotional. I mean, I was in tears after just 10 pages of that comic. And it's a great example of how visual storytelling in a very quick formats can make you feel things that dialogue or writing can't really do as powerfully. So can you talk a little bit about your process for visual storytelling, making these emotional stories that are just told purely by visuals and not by words?
Yeah, I think it's something that I always think is just it's almost like a really impactful way potentially of telling stories, but it's not easy to do that. And it's not, you could try and fail, and I have myself in the past. But I do think that for me, it's about, I suppose, like I wouldn't necessarily always be able to verbalize very eloquently all the emotions I'm going through. So I suppose in a way you're trying to reflect that in a film, or you're trying to reflect that in the story you're trying to tell. It's like, can you get across the emotional depth that maybe I wouldn't be able to describe very well with words, So the other thing I find that is if you leave space for the viewer or for the audience to basically not to project in onto the story, but if they have to lean in order to fully understand the emotion on that face, or the point of the story, it helps them, I think, to invest a little bit more into what you're trying to say, and they will be the ones to connect the dots. And I think if you let the audience connect the dots a little bit more, it also brings them into the emotion, and it helps them to feel it, because they're feeling it by trying to figure it out or trying to understand the story fully. They are bringing their own selves in. Whereas if you give them something that's completely, everything is on the surface and you're telling them exactly what to feel, being told exactly what to feel doesn't always make you feel it, So for me, that's why I gravitate a little bit towards those kind of stories. And in terms of trying to get there with those stories, sometimes what you can do is you can write the dialogue that the character might say, and then later on you might just take it out. And if it works without the dialogue, that's even better for me. I think that can be really powerful. But the other thing is just like thinking about visually striking images that can convey an emotion. It's just sometimes that's where the idea comes from in the first place for me, is like, it might be an image of a woman standing at the edge of a cliff and a big wave crashes up and passes her. And for me, that could be, is that exhilarating? Why is she so exhilarated there? What is that about? Why is she there? Anyway, so sometimes for me, it starts off with an image that might be striking in my mind, and I'm trying to get to the bottom of where that emotion is coming from that I feel when I think of it.
That's so interesting. I love what you're saying about letting the audience put their own perspective and emotions into the story, and I think that's really important, and you see that reflected everywhere, not just in emotional storytelling, but in horror or thriller, letting the audience connect the dots themselves, letting them put their own imagination into it, because there's nothing more powerful than our own imagination. No method of arts can express the imagination in our heads. Now, I want to shift a little bit towards the future of Cartoon Saloon and just the future of the industry. So the method that Cartoon Saloon uses to animate right now is pretty impressive, because it uses a combination of older techniques, hand-drawn animation, something that we've seen throughout the history of animation, but uses newer techniques, modern compositing tools, modern computer technology, modern CGI, modern 3D layering, in order to create a mixture that is really vibrant, but also still classical to animation. As technology improves and we have even more tools at our fingertips, what do you think the style is going to turn into? What do you see in the future?
Yeah, it's always exciting to think about that. It's a little bit of an abstract question, unless I think about specific projects, because I do often think like it just really depends on what each project or what each story needs. What is it trying to convey? What does it need? Where is the moments that we might need to go like above and beyond anything we've done before. And I do think like it's important that like basically if the tools are there, you should use whatever tools you need in order to create that thing. But I also feel like for me, it's always like drawing and line work, and basically 2D is something that I just always come back to, because for me it's an expressive medium, and it's kind of like it. I think it's a great place to begin. And of course you can always bring it further. We've started like using 3D cameras and things like that in order to be able to animate things that would have been almost impossible to do just completely in 2D. And also to make it possible to do it in a time frame that's reasonable, and it doesn't take us 15 years to make a feature film and all that kind of stuff. For me, I think I'll always look for bringing in more traditional skills and more traditional look into a modern pipeline, into a modern approach. So like, how could we bring in more, paint and textures, and handmade feeling? How can we bring that and elevate that into something that looks fantastic on a big screen? And in a way, I feel like that sort of, if you can elevate traditional mediums and traditional skill sets, they'll have a timeless quality. They're not going to, it's not going to be as clear that it might be dated in 5 years time or 10 years time. So I think in the studio, that's always been something that a lot of people are interested in. And I myself definitely want to always just see what else we can do, and what other challenges can we give ourselves for the next film and the next project.
I think you're right. Animation really is timeless, and people can see this by looking at Studio Ghibli films or the Disney classics. These films are generally 30, 40 years or older or more, but they still hold up today. They still look amazing today compared to live action, which has dated some, but animation, it still looks vibrant today as if it was just made. Now, the next project that Cartoon Saloon is working on, My Father's Dragon, can you talk a little bit about how that's different from the previous projects and how you guys are developing the style for that one?
Yeah, I mean, My Father's Dragon is sort of right in the middle of production at the moment. And so that means like everybody is working on every aspect of it right now, which is very exciting time. And basically, one of the big differences with My Father's Dragon is that because it's a Netflix film, this is the first time we've made a film solely with a streamer. Obviously, Apple Plus is part of the streaming side for Wolfwalkers, but Netflix came in from the very beginning of My Father's Dragon in terms of production, and that's been a totally new experience for the Saloon. And it's the first time we've been basically able to make a film completely in-house, or essentially in-house. Most of the time before, we had to make films as part of co-productions, which means splitting some of the departments or some parts of the departments going to other places in Europe to be animated or to be composited or to have music. And that helps to basically both get enough of crew, but also it's really about trying to finance the project to begin with. So with My Father's Dragon, the reins are taken off in a way, and you can really go for it because, okay, we're going to be able to build this in the studio. We're going to be able to think about our own team and build our own team and get the right people in the right positions. And that's been really amazing. And just being able to really give people opportunities within the studio to go for it, that have had previous experience before. So that's been really great. In terms of the direction, it's a really full-on visual experience. So it's different again, of course, to Wolfwalkers. It's not gonna, it's not the same kind of setting. It's not the same kind of world, but it's a new world for the studio to build and to kind of visualize. And that's been really exciting. And but at the same time, a lot of the same people back on the project. So that's also been lovely. Yeah.
I think we're all looking forward to it. And of course, something little special in both good ways and bad ways about My Father's Dragon is it has to be made during COVID, where everything has to be done remotely and safely. And something that's interesting is with Wolfwalkers, it happened in the middle of production, right? There was a shift during the production where everyone had to go home because of COVID in order to stay safe. So can you talk a little bit about how the studio has shifted because of COVID and how you think this last year now, how do you think this disease is going to impact the animation industry in the future?
Yeah, I think the studio were quite proactive about, getting people set up from home and things like that. So they did a really great job in getting a lot of people, their setups working from home, and everybody at the moment is essentially working from home now. in the studio. So it's been almost like we started working from home, I guess, in March last year, and now it's January. So for some people like myself, it's been almost, a full year now working from home. It's been a different experience. There's been some things that are, we're very, very efficient now with our meetings. Before, you would have a meeting and it would be like, okay, sorry, I'm 5 minutes late, or I needed to make a cup of tea. And now the meetings are kind of like, if you're 30 seconds late, you feel like you need to say why, because you can just click into meetings. So it means that in one way, people are very efficient. And, you get a lot of work done in your 8 hours. But at the same time, you miss that, you miss the sort of normal human component of just being able to converse about things outside of official meetings. And that leads to a little bit of anxiety, I think, in terms of like separation. And I think it's harder for things to happen naturally. So sometimes, it might feel a bit more forced that you have to have certain conversations, or a little bit more formal than it would be if you were all together in the same building. There is some advantages though. I mean, I do think that in the future, I think there will be a lot more remote work possible for people, even if it's not full-time remote. Maybe people will just be able to work from home some days a week. Certainly, I think that's actually quite a big deal for people who have families. If they can work from home sometimes, that might actually be a big bonus, especially for women in the industry. That might make it more likely that they'll be able to stay on in the industry for later into their careers and later into their lives. And I also think, from people from different countries, we're working with people all over Europe at the moment in different places. But there is limits to it. Time zones are, working with somebody on the opposite side of the world, the time zones can make things very difficult as well. So I think there is advantages to it. And I think some of those advantages, I think it's proven that it's possible to continue to work remotely. But I do think it's hard on people. I think it's a little tougher emotionally. And I think it's not quite as fun when you're not all together, So personally, I'm really looking forward to going back into the studio and working with the team again. But it's nice to know that we were still able to all keep going in the meantime.
Yeah, it's definitely something that you really can't replicate. It's just the feeling of being in a group of people in person, being able to collaborate ideas, bounce ideas off the walls. You can't really mimic that on Zoom, unfortunately. Even interviews like this, there is something different about being in a Zoom window than being in person, sitting together, talking. You can't really replicate that digitally. But I want to also talk a little bit about, advice that you have for future filmmakers, because you're not only covering, animators, you're also covering animation directors, people who want to lead projects, want to define the stories that are told in the animation industry. So to start off with, just what advice would you give to animators to become a confident storytelling? Something that you talked about in other interviews for Late Afternoon is the importance of being a confident storyteller, because that story is personal to you. You said it took bravery to tell that story. So how did you become a confident storyteller? What tips would you give to become a confident storyteller?
I think one of the things that I personally had to go through was certainly a certain amount of trial and error. And I had to kind of let go of the insecurities that I think come from early on in your career. Where you kind of think, well, I often have this kind of critic in my head who's the snobbiest snob of animators who tells me that nothing I'm doing is interesting as it should be and all this kind of stuff. And you have to, at a certain point, you have to just say, well, I'm still going to tell those stories. I'm still going to try, even if it's not as good as I want it to be. So a lot of it is just about persistence. You need to just keep trying and keep telling your stories in whatever way you can. One of the practical things I started doing was just writing, even though as an animator, I'm not really naturally drawn to writing, but I do find it a really good way of just get your ideas out in any way, even if you don't show it to somebody. And your writing might take the form of like literally writing a script, or it might just be writing a couple of paragraphs like in prose, or it might even be just boarding. It might just be drawing the characters and thinking about it more visually. I think whatever works for you, just try and get your ideas down in some form and let them percolate, and come back to them later. you don't have to, if you can, don't try and force it, and try and, sometimes you have to have some idea that you need to pitch. That's different. But if you can, I would say, like, put your ideas down, let them percolate. The ones that come back to you a lot are probably the ones that you're gonna, are really, there's something in there that's important to you. That's what I'd say. So I think listen to your own thoughts in that way. If there's an idea that keeps rising up to the surface, then that's probably something you need to pursue. So that's kind of one of the main things, I think, is just keep at it and keep writing your stories down, and then, when you get a chance to, you can hopefully have something ready then to show or to pitch or to move forward with.
And taking to the next stage, of course, Late Afternoon was a short film, and it wasn't your only short animated film. You've had others before. So for people who are getting started and they want to make their short animated films and they want to go through the pitching process, because I believe you, if I recall correctly, you pitched Late Afternoon to Cartoon Saloon, correct?
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about the pitching process, getting that short animated film and just getting it out there for people to see? What tips would you give?
Yeah. Again, Late Afternoon took me quite a long time to basically to prepare, I guess, in my mind, to develop. And I let that happen. Like I was saying, I kind of didn't want to force it. So I waited until I knew I had the idea right in my own mind. I wrote it then, and I just tried to consider basically, like, what's the most straightforward way to pitch this? I wrote a short script. I mean, it's just a short film, so it was like a less than 10-page script. And then basically tried to zero in on, like, to know myself. When I'm able to pitch it is when I'm able to talk about the project and understand why I'm making it, and sometimes it doesn't always, you don't know why am I so drawn to this idea, and you have to figure that out. And if you can know that when you're pitching it, that's a very important thing, because that's a lot of times, like, that's what people will latch onto when you pitch. The story can be good or interesting, but it's really about what is driving it. Why are you so interested in making it? Where is the enthusiasm coming from? And if you know that, then that will really help as well while you're actually making the film. And that's kind of what I focused on when I pitched it. And that's, what I focused on when we pitched it to the film board as well in Ireland for funding. And that's kind of, that's where I think that that's for me what's important.
Well, Louise, sadly, that is all the time we have. Thank you so much for talking to us today.
Oh, thanks very much. Yeah, no, it was great questions. So it was lovely.
Thank you. And for our audience, make sure to check out Wolfwalkers. It is their latest film. I love it. It's so beautifully done. It's available on Apple TV+. And stay tuned for their next film, My Father's Dragon, coming to Netflix very soon. But thank you so much for watching. This interview has been made possible by the VIEWConference. It is a yearly CG event that is taking place in Italy between October 17th and October 22nd. For more interviews like these and information about how you can get tickets to the conference, go to viewconference.it. I'm your host, Jerry Orr, signing off. Bye!